Okay.
All right, so our next presentation is the early days of hockey in Southern Ontario and Western New York by Kevin Fisher. He was born and raised in Buffalo, and he still currently lives there. He's a lifelong hockey fan, especially with the Sabres and Canadians. His interest in hockey history began while he was living in Montreal. And he joined our organization back in 2017. So here's Kevin.
Good evening, everyone.
We're just getting set up. All right, so yeah, we should be able to do this. You can try on the arrow keys, see how it goes. The picture.
Oh, yeah. And to move it, just hit this. Or the,
I think so, and the click on the mouse should do it too. Please.
oh, they're there. Okay, got it.
You type it in as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, good morning again, everyone. Thanks. I did write an article appear in the most recent edition of the Journal in December, so about this topic. But I have some additional information. Unfortunately, I have many more pictures. It's difficult to come by, especially with the pandemic. And I think because of the era. But anyways, and I should probably specify, I'm talking more about hockey that took place on the Niagara Peninsula and then its movement to Buffalo, New York, because the proximity I'm interested in the reason why I'm trying to figure out over many years since I've been doing the research is with Buffalo being so close or Western New York so close to the Niagara Peninsula, why did it take so long for hockey to cross just the river, which is not even more than 1.2 kilometers wide. And the Niagara Peninsula extends from the Niagara River all the way over to including Hamilton. So organized hockey really started on the Niagara Peninsula in these three cities, in Hamilton, St. Catharines, and in Niagara Falls for the most part. And then another question I had is, I'm kicking around, is once hockey finally arrived in Western New York, why didn't it experience the boom like it did in Southern Ontario or in Canada overall? Why did it seem like it took so much longer for the people to really, it was always, people liked hockey in Western New York, but it was always a smaller population and followers than it was there. So hockey in this region began around 1890, 1892. Hamilton had its first club in 1892. And then St. Catharines and Niagara Falls followed just a few months later, so it was 1893, January or so, 1893. And in that first season, 1892-93, the games took place for only scrimmages or friendly matches. In fact, Niagara Falls' first game took place there against the Ridley College team, which is Ridley College located here in St. Catharines, and it still has a hockey program too. So it goes back pretty far. Go ahead. Oh, thanks. Hamilton and Niagara Falls also played the game together. When Hamilton visited Niagara Falls, they lost 7-3. But then when Niagara Falls visited Hamilton, they lost 4-3. So I guess there was, even back then, a such thing as home ice advantage. You can see here, Hamilton played on the Thistle rink, which was really a curling rink, but it was a real building. It was a real ice rink, natural ice, of course, back then. But I haven't seen too much about the type of rink that Niagara Falls played. And I don't think, I have the impression it was an enclosed rink, but I don't think it was as elaborate as that. But so far, and Niagara Falls was smaller. It was a town back then. It hadn't become a city. So at the time, I think it was just maybe winter, they put boards up and a roof just to protect the hockey players. So after that, following that season, 92-93, Niagara Falls and Hamilton and St. Catharines all applied to be members of the OHA. And that was a season that the OHA then saw had about 19 senior teams. It depends on what you read, of course. In one account, I saw that St. Thomas dropped out right before the season began, but St. Thomas was going to be in along with the OHA, but it looks like they dropped out before the season got going. And so St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, and Hamilton formed. They were included in what they called the Hamilton group. And then out west, there were two groups with London, Ayr, and Stratford, and Berlin, of course, Kitchener. And Toronto had two groups each of three teams, Granite, Toronto, and the Victoria teams. And varsity Trinity and Osgood Hall teams were in another group. And then out east in the Kingston group were four teams that included Ottawa too. So it was Kingston, Royal Military College, and Queen's University. The first game within the Hamilton group, St. Catharines visited Hamilton. The game took place on January 11th, 1894. And of course, St. Catharines had to travel because they didn't have a rink that was suitable for hockey. The OHA rules required a covered rink. And St. Catharines they could only practice either on the canal, the ice was thin, that's kind of dangerous, or probably on smaller skating rinks, but they didn't have a large enough rink to have hockey games. So they always had to travel, which of course could cause some arguments because they couldn't raise any funds to support their club. So there was an argument once I saw that the St. Catharines team tried to claim that they should have part of the gate receipts because half their fans were in Niagara Falls. They lost that argument. So I was wondering, if they tried that in Buffalo, when the Leafs fans are in Buffalo, then Buffalo wouldn't make any money in those games. So for the rest of the season, that's a layout for the following season. You can see Hamilton won 3-1. Niagara Falls ended up with 2 wins and 2 losses, and St. Catharines, the only game they won was their first game against Hamilton, against 6-4. And I guess Hamilton woke up, or they weren't maybe in shape for that first matchup. There was also, that was a controversial season for the Niagara Falls club because they were smaller guys. Hamilton's team members were mostly rugby football players. I think they played the game pretty physically. So in the first game, in their first matchup, they knocked around the Niagara Falls guys pretty much. And so then for the following game, Niagara Falls said they were going to shore up their ranks with some bigger guys. They didn't do it. I think it was more an empty threat, but obviously it didn't help them because they ended up losing again. There are only 2 guys on the Niagara Falls team that Hamilton stayed away from. I don't know. There's one guy named Cole, another guy named Harry Stevens, who ended up becoming the mayor of Niagara Falls when it became a city in 1904. So he had an interesting career in the public sector. At the end of this season, 93-94, because of the experience that St. Catharines Niagara Falls had, they felt that they were the stronger, the OHA leadership had a bias against the weaker teams. And at the time, OHA had 2 divisions. They had a senior division and a junior division. The senior level was more, it had nothing to do with the age, but with the skill level. So I suppose if Niagara Falls and St. Catharines had been placed in the junior division, maybe it would have been a better experience for them. But and then in that Niagara Falls game, I think they also turned away because in the rough game against Hamilton, the Hamilton basically picked the referee that they wanted to use for the away game, and the referee was part of the Hamilton squad anyway, or he had a family member on the Hamilton squad. So I think there's some bias there as well. At the end of the season, then, that's when Niagara Falls and St. Catharines decided that they were going to drop out of the OHA and form their own club. They call it the Southern Ontario Hockey Association. And so they met in Hamilton in October of '94, along with a club from Paris and another club from Hamilton out of the Victoria rink. And they formed what they called the Southern Ontario Hockey Association. And they adopted the same rules as the OHA, which meant that St. Catharines still had to hit the road to play their games. In fact, St. Catharines, they didn't have a rink until 1898 finally here in town, a rink for hockey, of course. Not too far from here, across from, one was on Queen Street and the other one was around the corner on Ontario Street. So for that following season, they had more games. They were able to play more games because they had more teams against each other. And you can see Paris was a stronger club that year, even though it was a smaller town. And they ended up winning that grid, or that grouping 5-1. the two games are missing for Hamilton and St. Catharines. I don't know if they didn't end up playing, or if I just haven't been able to locate those scores yet in the sources I've been looking at. But nevertheless, you can see that Paris came out on top on that one. And then Paris then ended up, for bragging rights, played against a team from Ayr for the Southern Ontario Championship, and they lost to the squad from Ayr. But that was it. They didn't go on. Paris didn't make a challenge to any other team there. And again, these were all just amateurs. There wasn't any professionalism at that time. In the following years for the SIHR, it actually grew. At one point, it had three divisions, in fact. It was also interesting, I think, is the first league to adopt the use of goal nets. It was in 1898, they had a meeting right here in St. Catharines for their 98-99 season, and they decided they would use goal nets. It was the first league to do so. The OHA at the time thought that they would take a wait and see attitude, see how it played out. There's some objections because the net was extended back to the end board, so it prevented play behind the net, and they didn't like that, obviously. And then when the OHA finally decided to go to see how the nets in action the following year, they went to Montreal instead of coming down here to Southern Ontario to see in use. So they watched a Shamrocks Victoria's game to see how the nets were. They only came away with the idea, at least in the OHA, not to extend the net, but to use lead weights to keep the nets on the ice, so they could still encourage play behind the nets. You might know too, an article by Paul Kitchen, 2001 in the Journal in 2001. He also had a nice article about the use of goal nets in the history of goal nets. So that's where I got some of my information for him for that there. I'm going to move on to the Buffalo story now, because this is talking about the movement from Buffalo. And I think I found the guy almost like the Buffalo version of Toronto's Tom Payton, who introduced hockey to the citizens of Western New York. And his name is William J. McFall. This is a picture of him I was lucky to find a couple weeks ago. He grew up in Niagara Falls, Ontario. He went to school there. But after his formal schooling, he attended a school just across the river in Lewiston called the DeVoe School, which was a boys' preparatory military-themed school. And here he is with a group of his classmates. At that point, he's about 18 years old, William McFall. On the back of the photograph, it's interesting. Whoever took the photo, Warren Tucker, he's the smaller guy here. On the back, he wrote the nicknames of all his friends in that picture, and they called McFall the Canuck. That's what they referred to him as. So I'm convinced that McFall is the one that introduced hockey, because at the time, Buffalo had never heard of hockey. And then about 2 weeks later, but after McFall moved, this appeared in the Buffalo News in the end of November. So he had taken a job at one point to move to Buffalo. At first, he was supposed to move to Rochester, but lucky for us, I think he moved to Buffalo. So he visited probably his former teammates included in Niagara Falls at the end of November, and came back with an idea that he wanted to introduce people to the game of hockey. And I know it might be considered circumstantial evidence, but I also think that up until then, if you consider the fact that he wasn't not the first Canadian immigrant to arrive in Buffalo, with the exchange that was happening across already, he was just the first one, I think, with the game experience that wanted to continue and bring excitement to his new fellow citizens. So about 2 weeks after this meeting, or this announcement took place, there was a meeting that they held to form one club that would represent Buffalo against teams from Southern Ontario, obviously the Niagara Peninsula, and maybe also Pittsburgh, New York. But when so many guys show up, they had about a dozen guys show up, they realized that they had enough people, not just for one team, but for probably a league, because the 12 men that showed up were all representing other teams that had already been formed. So I think that in the time period between McFall's announcement that he was going to do this and the meeting, I think he made the rounds to different sporting goods stores and athletic groups, and maybe even speaking to fellow Canadians, and try to drum up interest in forming a hockey club. This was also interesting too, I think, the year that some Canadian teams were kind of, they call it barnstorming, going into the States, at New York City and Washington, DC, and Baltimore to show interest in hockey, but for some reason Buffalo was left off that list. I don't know why. Maybe they figured people are already playing hockey there, but no teams from, say, Montreal or Toronto came down to interest hockey. It fell on this one young fan's shoulders. I want to show you this. This is an interesting too. I think it reinforced the change that took place almost overnight after the meeting. So on the left is advertisement from the sporting goods store called Sweet and Jonah, and that's where the first meeting took place. And you can see that they're, in addition to advertising the Whitley exerciser, they mentioned that they are carrying ice skates in their inventory. Nothing about hockey yet, but then 2 weeks later, the same store is mentioning they have the same ice skate, but they also are specifying that it's a hockey skate too. They sell hockey skates. And this is just an example. There are other examples too that I found where a sporting goods store for the winter up until, say, December, every December, November up till then only talked about, or every year up until December '95 mentioned we have hockey skate or ice skates, remember, hockey skates. And then obviously after that first year, now they say they're selling hockey sticks and hockey pucks and so forth. And so I don't know actually where the men who showed up to play hockey or interested in playing hockey would have gotten their equipment if they weren't Canadian. I guess maybe they sent someone across the border perhaps to procure it or order them online, but up until then you couldn't get a hockey stick in Buffalo, it seems. So it's funny too, because they call themselves outfitters for every known pastime. Well, I guess only known to them, because now before then they didn't know about hockey, and hockey existed. So so after that first meeting, teams were arranged at different rinks around the city of Buffalo. There are 3 teams that call themselves the one Caledonians, one the Crystals, and one the Olympic Parks. Those were all hockey rinks. Olympic Park was a baseball stadium that they flooded every year for hockey. And I'm not saying that McFall was the only one to bring hockey. I think he had help, but he really got the ball moving, or I guess the puck moving. There was another player that had immigrated that same year that I don't know too much about because his name seems more common. His name is Robertson, William J. Robertson. He came from Manitoba. He was on the, he came from Rat Portage. His team had won the championship of Manitoba in the Pacific Northwest that same 1895, March of 1895. So I think together, those two, their experience in organized league play kind of pushed them to introduce the game to Buffalo. So I think there are about, at least from what I could find so far, 6 teams that were organized for that very first unofficial winter. They never got an actual league off the ground after all. The games that took place were scrimmages. Players could move from team to team. There was no organized league, as I mentioned. 3 other teams. There was a team that called themselves the Storm Kings. There's a team that called themselves the Bankers. That was unlike bank teams in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa at the time that were associated with individual banks. This was just a team with bankers from all of Buffalo banks, because they obviously have enough players. And there was also, for the bank team, a Canadian again from this area, Frank Mabey. So it seemed like it was always, the Canadians who were living in Buffalo waited for just this one person to arrive to, as I say, get the ball growing. That fell onto McFall's shoulders. And so this Frank Mabey, he led up the banking team. And then there was another man when UB formed its team, the University of Buffalo. This was the first season as well for the University of Buffalo. And most of the players there are Canadian. So the man in the middle, the tall one, Irving Johnson, and next to him is Harry Howell. They're both from right here in St. Catharines. And Irving Johnson was instrumental in forming the UB team. I like this photograph. I didn't find it till a little later. I had a grainy one but I was lucky to find this online. And their uniforms, if you could see, obviously black and white, but those stripes are blue and white, and those are still the colors of the University of Buffalo today. They were blue and white. Irving Johnson went on to become a physician. All the players were made up of the dental and medical schools at the university at that time. And in the following years, UB continued to play, but again, there was still no organized hockey in Buffalo. That's what I mean. There was an interest, but a small following that never really got off the ground until around 1900. In that same season, finally a game did take place, an exhibition game with Niagara Falls. A team from the Crystal Rink invited the Niagara Falls team, Niagara Falls, Ontario, to play on their rink. And they actually held off the Niagara Falls team for the first half until the very few minutes when the Crystals opened up the scoring. But then in the second half, Niagara Falls scored 4 unanswered goals and ended up winning that contest 4-1. So that was the first cross-border hockey game that took place in Buffalo as well. So, no, there was never a rink in Buffalo until, let's say, the 1940s, a true rink for hockey. And that brings me to another question, similar to the one I asked in the beginning, is Buffalo is probably as big as Toronto and Montreal population-wise. It had about 335,000 people at the time. And it had its share of wealthy tycoons, but none of them ever thought about investing, taking the risk to invest in the rink, because of course an indoor rink could have supported the growth of the game, not just for spectators, but for the players as well. So those are also questions I've had in my head over the years, is why these rich guys never decided to create a rink that could, seem like it was a working investment in other places. Why not? Why didn't they do it as well? So. So if you have any answers, you can write me your answers on my email. But that's a brief history of St. Catharines and Buffalo. Thanks, guys.
So,
Oh, sorry.
questions.
Go ahead, yes, sir.
Just one, granted, this is a little bit later than your era, but another thing Niagara Peninsula is very famous for. There's a town called Grimsby just up the road here, famous for its peaches. For 4 years in the early 1920s, the Montreal Canadiens held their training camp there because there was no artificial ice in Montreal. And they had a refrigeration plant there to keep the peaches fresh, and they hooked the refrigeration plant up to the old Grimsby Arena to make ice in September. So the Canadians trained there for 4 years.
What years was that?
1922 to 24.
Okay. Wow. Yes, Mike.
Yes, Kevin, you mentioned that there was a rig that got started in Buffalo. Clearly, the purpose of it wasn't hockey. What was the reason for building the rink?
Which rink?
The very first rink in Buffalo.
Oh, the very first rink, was that outdoor one? That was not the first one. That was just the first big one. That was 4 acres of ice. Before then, there were other ice skating rinks were formed. There were curling rinks as well.
Hello.
Let's get your chair.
In the 1860s, Buffalo did have a covered ice skating rink. It was 200 by 75 feet, but it didn't last long. It lasted only about 10 years. And that was the last covered rink until the real true covered rink in 1940 when it opened as the Memorial Auditorium. So in that time period, it was always just outdoor curling rinks or flooded lots.
Just to touch on that, in the 1890s, in all parts of Ontario, there were very few purpose-built buildings for skating or hockey. Somebody would find a building with a large open surface, and they would just open all the windows and flood it,
Mhm,
build boards around it and call it the rink for the year.
mhm, mhm.
And it would change year to year in some towns.
Oh,
where
okay,
It would be in a different building every year. And that's what, as you were saying, in St. Catharines, and I believe Niagara on the Lake as well, didn't have indoor rinks. They only had outdoor rinks, which is why they couldn't be members of the OHA. So it was 95, 96, somewhere around there, they implemented the rule
Yeah,
that to be in the OHA, you have to have an indoor rink. The one exception is Brockville managed to work their way around that somehow, where they continue to have an outdoor rink in Brockville.
I think they said with no obstructions, right? So that they couldn't get, they'd have a
They said they
grandstand.
were gonna have an indoor rink and then they just didn't do it, and Cornwall never protested.
Okay.
It wasn't until they got to the next round.
One last question.
Yeah, Kevin, were there any Americans of significance developed in this particular area?
And is there, no, later on, maybe in the, 1905, 1906, there was a high school player who was actually a bigger baseball player. His name was Magner, Edmund Magner. He played on a high school team. He ended up at Cornell to play hockey, but he ended up then becoming a pro baseball player. So he was probably the first.
This is an all Canadian team?
That was mostly Canadian. One of the guys came from Pennsylvania. But the manager at the top, Prof, and then Johnson and Howell are from Southern Ontario here.
And is Howell related to the Harry Howell at Hamilton? NHL?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I was trying to find out. I don't know. But
The first big star of the University of Buffalo was a guy, Herb Rayner, who played in Kingston for a number of years. And then I think he went to Buffalo to get his medical degree, played a year or two in Buffalo, and then moved on to Pittsburgh, where he played in the pro leagues down in Pittsburgh.
and what year was that?
The first really big name that I know of that played in Buffalo was Herbie Rayner.
Okay, Herbie Rayner. Which year was that?
That would have been around 1900.
900.
Okay, just for the anecdotes, 30 seconds, in 1839, British soldiers played hockey in the Chippewa River, I'm not sure how to pronounce it,
Mm-hmm.
and Niagara Falls.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was probably the first
Yeah,
recorded hockey.
I saw it in, in the book. That's.
Oh, so that would be the birth of hockey in Canada.
Not in the other ones.
All right, thank you, Kevin.
All right, I can do a stop. This, and I'll hit record again.